Okay, hello everybody. Welcome to our third meeting of SoCal Loopers. Learn all about Loop. It's 2 p.m. in California. I give you the warning that this is a do-it-yourself project. Anything you do is at your own risk. You create your own loop. You ask a lot of questions, but nobody does this for you, and you take full responsibility. There, I'm done. I'm Joanne Milo. Type 1 for 55 years, run a blog called thesavvydiabetic.com. I want to introduce Glenn Weber. You can introduce yourself.
Hello, I'm Glenn Weber, and I've had type 1 for about 44 years and have been looping for about 6 months.
Cassidy.
I am Cassidy Robinson. I'm 27 years into T1D. I've been looping for just over 2 years, thanks to Katie DeSimone, who took me in very randomly off of Looped Group while I was on a bike trip.
Okay, and Kenny.
My name is Kenny Fox. I have a daughter who is 6, and we've been looping since July of last year, 2019.
All right, so here, I just put up the agenda. It's a daunting task, and Kenny seems up for it. First of all, thank you, Kenny, for doing what you do. It's really been helpful for so many people. We're getting such amazing response, and enlighten us today.
Keep in mind that anything I say is my opinion only. I'm not a doctor. This is not medical advice. I'll even be sharing some of the things I've learned as I've helped people that has worked kind of across ages and people. But again, there's really no substitute for testing your basal ISF and carb ratios, as Katie mentions in some of her blog posts. So always keep that in mind, and what's working for me may not work for you. So here we go. So what we're going to do is try to figure out what basal does and what it doesn't do. How you can kind of test or see that it's good in closed loop, how to leverage ISF to manage overnight blood sugars. Again, that's something I think works pretty well, and hopefully sleep some more. So basal insulin. What is basal insulin? So it's mostly, its job is to provide the body with the right amount of insulin to cover just normal sugar glucose production in a fasting state. So no food happening, just what your body needs all the time. So that's the idea. And then it's used to create a steadier level blood sugar, again, when food and activity and things aren't around. So what basal insulin is not, it's not for necessarily for lowering blood sugar. It's not even for raising it either. Unless you turn it off. Like if you're on a normal pump without loop, you could turn off your basal. And if your basal's right, eventually that should raise you up. So it's supposed to keep you steady, and then boluses, or in the case of loop, kind of increased temporary basal rates, extra insulin above and beyond your basal is what's supposed to move you down, and cutting it back can make you go up. So it's really kind of a, for those of you who haven't been on MDI in a while, on shots, it's really kind of built in there where it's, you kind of have basal insulin. Mostly you're using that to kind of make your overnight steady, because that's the time when you're usually not eating. And then you kind of use bolus or injection insulin with your other rapid insulin from there. So kind of a back to basics idea here. Okay, so how does loop use basal? So again, basal insulin is supposed to be neutral, supposed to be what your body needs. So whatever you put in the scheduled basal rate inside the Loop app is what Loop is going to assume is what you need to just kind of stay level. But what Loop will do is it will use, you can see the pictures over here, we'll use different rates or changes in your basal to give you more or less insulin. So this middle one here, the 0 + 0, is what you normally see when Loop is running the scheduled basal rate, what you said is good to kind of break even. When it's something less than your scheduled, you'll see it underneath with a negative number, and that will tell you how much less than your scheduled it is. And the number on the on the right here is the higher one, meaning there's running a basal rate that's giving you X amount more than your scheduled basal. It's not telling you, again, like we talked about earlier, it's not the basal rate that's being run, it's how much more than you've told Loop is what you need to just keep you level. So active insulin, which is active insulin in the Loop app is also called IOB in other cases, in other situations, maybe in the pump you're used to, or a Nightscout. That's going to tell you like how much insulin above and beyond your scheduled basal that you have set is Loop is tracking as in your body at the time. So what Loop can do is it can use the increases to give you more to make this active insulin number go up, and it can use the lower section here to start taking some away. Because if you're not running any basal, if you're turning it lower than what you've said you need, anything less than that should start to take your body's like need for insulin, just the basic body function, and it should start using that. It started using the active insulin up just as part of your body's normal functioning. So if you had a unit on board that's more than you need, if you turned off your basal rate is 1 unit per hour, in theory, if you turned off your basal for about an hour, you would basically have 0 active insulin, and you'd have just what you need in your body to keep you level after about an hour. Okay, you can kind of see the lower screen here is the insulin delivery screen. This is kind of an example of Loop modulating or moving basal rate, temporary basal rates up and down. Remember, the line across the bottom is the scheduled basal. Not that it's running 0, but that what you said is what you need on average. And so then you'll see the boxes that go up, that's where Loop is increasing the temporary basal rate, and going down is where it's decreasing it. So there you go, there's that. Active insulin. Okay, so what is this stuff we talked about? It's above and beyond what you need for basal, but it has multiple names, like I mentioned. It says active insulin is in the Loop app, or insulin on board is kind of most other places. An example, you can see the pictures down here. Active insulin, the picture on the left is what's in Loop, and then like a screenshot on the right here is this top right corner of Nightscout where you see IOB, or insulin on board. So those are the same thing. So you'll see people use those words interchangeably. So that way you're not too confused by all the acronyms. And then positive IOB, or active insulin, should make your blood sugar go down, or at least stop it from going up if there's food, right? So without food or some other kind of like stress or upward force, you wouldn't, that you're trying to counter with that active insulin. The goal of positive IOB is to keep you from going up or make you go back down. Negative IOB is should make your blood sugar go up. So you shouldn't see negative too much. Like in this screenshot here is actually quite a bit. Means the basal was a little too high. So whenever you see negative insulin on board, which we'll cover in a few seconds here, you should see your blood sugar going up, because it means you're missing insulin. So if you're not missing any, if you're still going down, or you've been staying level for a long time, then what Loop understands is how much insulin's in your body or your basal needs is off. And so we need to fix that. So the negative IOB is probably the easiest one to see when your basal rates are off, when it's like too strong. So if you're continuing to fall with negative IOB, it'll be your key here. So, oops, sorry. Okay, so examples. This is in Nightscout, these 2 screenshots here. It's the easiest way to go grab history. So on the left, IOB of 0 is a example of a kind of a good basal here. So it wore out, and insulin on board is pretty close to 0, and you're seeing that plus 0. You're not really moving. Actually, if you look at the dots here, there's not really a whole lot of movement in the last 20 or 30 minutes there. So that's an example of where you have a good balance. Your basal rate that you're telling Loop is probably pretty accurate, because you've reached this nice stasis level where you're flat and hopefully at target, hopefully where you want to be. If you're not where you told Loop you want to be in your correction range, and it doesn't predict you're going to go to that correction range, then it will make changes. So I think this person, Loop, thinks this prediction line here is going to go up a little bit higher than where they need to be. And so it's increasing the temporary basal there at 0.65, a little more than the schedule. In Nightscout, Nightscout, I didn't actually write this on purpose, but in Nightscout, there's the dotted line when you render your basal, and the dotted line means that's the level where you said your scheduled basal is. So like the bottom of the graph in the Loop app means scheduled basal, but in Nightscout, all the way up or down, depending on how you're rendering your basal, is off, and the dotted line is what you've said is your scheduled basal. And that can kind of shift. Even in this example here, you see out right around 4 p.m. the basal starts to go up, the scheduled basal. And this is what Loop's looking, or Nightscout's looking out ahead to say, oh, the scheduled basal is going to go up eventually. But what we're talking about is this current time frame here. On the right, you have an example of negative insulin on board and your blood sugar going up. So you have a little bit of negative, not a whole lot, and you're starting to see upward movement. You can see these last couple dots have all been moving up. So, and this is a younger individual with a lighter basal rate. So basal of almost negative 0.1 is actually fairly substantial. So for example, my daughter's basal rate is 0.2. So that's half of her basal rate still in negative, which means we should start seeing pretty good upward movement, which you are in this particular screenshot here. So this is what you should see. 2 examples of what you should see. A couple of examples of what you shouldn't see that would tell you when your basal is too strong is negative insulin on board and going down. So sometimes it can be a little more dramatic, like on the left here, where the insulin on board is accruing, and I put this like little colored bar here to mention the negative IOB. This is where it started, where the arrow starts. That's where the negative insulin on board starts accruing. And it keeps getting a little more negative. Again, some with a smaller basal rate. It keeps accruing here. So this is like about an hour's worth of basal being off. Like you should start seeing movement up, not down. And a -4 is actually fairly significant in most cases for an overnight kind of drop. You should want to see this starting to get down like -2 or 1 as you start approaching what should be an accurate basal amount if you've kind of overdone it still. So you should start seeing some slowing, and this isn't really slowing down. Negative insulin on board on the right here shows that like it almost levels out, but then drops a little bit. So you can kind of see the basal turned on and off a couple times, but then once Loop saw that it was heading down, it cuts basal again. So they had negative IOB through most of this little orange box here. So Loop was expecting, if I had scrolled back a little, you could see Loop was expecting a rise in blood sugar to occur shortly after this, probably right about where the drop was happening. It was expecting it to go up, which is why the basal was turned back on, as you can see at the top here. So a -5 with a negative insulin on board, not that great. Means the basal is too strong. So you can scroll back in Nightscout to see these, much easier than you can in Loop, but you can still use the Loop app, and you can kind of, especially if you turn it sideways, it might be easier, but you can align the blood sugar graph at the top with the active insulin, the second graph on the next one down, and you can make sure that those are aligning. So you start seeing the active insulin go underneath, you should start seeing blood sugar values start to go up. So you can still use it in the Loop app, it's just harder to go back and research. And what I'll show you in a minute is how to do this with reports in Nightscout. So there you go, look at that. That was next. Okay, so for those of you that have Nightscout, if you have another monitor, or you can pay attention while you have it open, or have it open on your phone even, not as easy to see, but you can go ahead and try this. So if you go to your Nightscout site and you hit the 3 lines here, the menu button, and click on reports. The first report that you start with is day to day. First, you want to set your date range. I mean, usually you're just looking at recent history, so it defaults to like 1 week. That's perfectly fine. It's a little out of order the way the screen's laid out, so that's why I put numbers on here. The second thing you want to do is to turn on the insulin on board and the carbs on board, the COB boxes on the bottom there. I also like to turn off this insulin distribution one, just because it takes up space that I don't need, but that's up to you. And then if you care, you can change the size of the graphs that it renders, how big you want the pictures to be. In step 3, that's totally optional. But number 2 is important. And number 1 is important if you want to look at a certain day. And then number 4, you press the show button. So I think, there we go. Here's an example of what one of these days looks like. I just took this one from Tessa a little bit ago. The blue line that kind of runs along the bottom is the insulin on board line as reported by Loop. So Loop sends back data to Nightscout every 5 minutes, and so it's telling it what its insulin on board is. The blue bars that you see in these reports are your basal rate that it's running. You'll see that they're up around the dotted line here. That's the scheduled basal rate, and because I'm using the automatic bolus branch, you'll see I don't really have any bars above that. But you do see lots of little baby boluses. These blue lines, these blue bars are boluses. There's lots of little ones on mine here. So you can see here as a quick example, you can see this goes just a tiny bit negative. The negative IOB shows up when it goes underneath the graph. The downside, the way this is shown, is that if it's relatively substantial negative insulin on board, it just kind of cuts off and just goes so low and then gets cut off by the graph below it. So you can't always use that to get a sense for maybe how far off your basals are. You're just gonna have to scroll back in Nightscout from a recent day or just take guesses and start changing your rates. But you do see that the negative happens kind of right after 4 o'clock, and right about the same time you see an increase in blood sugar values. They jump up, and then a lot of boluses keep it from getting too out of control. Part of that's probably a little bit of compression. This makes the nighttime a little bit tricky. She's probably laying on her sensor just a little bit, so it exaggerated the jump when she probably rolled over. But insulin was off, so she's going to go up higher than she was. So that's the fun game Luke gets to play all night when she's laying on her sensor. But there you go. The red line, so this red line that kind of cuts across the bottom, this is your carbs on board, again, as reported by Loop, using the absorption time that you entered for the entry. Now, we briefly talked about it last time, but the absorption time that Loop actually uses, you enter, one value, but Loop's prediction sort of expects it to take a little bit longer than what you entered. So if you say 2 hours, it's kind of looking at like a 3-hour expectation for carbs to last. So keep that in mind when you're looking at this number. But it is nice to see how insulin on board should track with carbs on board, and hopefully your blood sugar kind of is doing what it should be doing as long as there's food there. So that's what the red line is. And then boluses and carb entries are pretty easy to see. They're the red bars and the blue bars. And then at the top, you'll see, any extended notes you made or overrides will show up here as well. If you update to the latest version of Nightscout, version 13, you'll see these notes and overrides a little bit better than those of you on version 12. Yeah, so that's it here. And then I have another example. Yeah, I'll show it again in a second. Okay, but what you'll see here is on the next one is a few examples of where probably like red and yellow loops occurred. You'll see that like this red bar here, this like big carb entry of 60 grams, kind of just like disappears and then kind of picks back up again here around 11:30. Same with these other spots where I put these arrows. There's like missing insulin on board and missing carbs on board information. And that's because Loop's not sending that information back to Nightscout, probably because it hasn't looped, hasn't connected to the pump and all that. So when you have red and yellow loops, this is another kind of cheater way to see how many red and yellow loops I guess you're having of any significance. But that also explains the gaps in the data here. So it makes it kind of hard to see if your basal's right. If you're having trouble with these overnight, I was helping somebody recently that was having it cut out the majority of the night. So it made it kind of hard to see if they were going kind of over and under on their insulin on board. So I just thought I'd point that out. It's taken me a while to figure out what that is, but that's an example. And another example at the top here, you see the gray bars. These are overrides, but this is in version 12, so you can't see the what it's called, the name of it. So there you go. All right. All right. Insulin sensitivity. ISF should be, excuse me, the amount of 1 unit of insulin drops your blood sugar without anything else or like anything unusual. So I highlight that and you'll see why in a second. But that's why the number can feel a little bit backwards, where like a bigger number means your blood sugar will move more. It's like you're going to increase sensitivity because that means 1 unit of blood sugar will move you 200 points versus some of you who maybe have 1 unit of insulin will move you 50 points or 40 points. MGDL, when I say points, for those of you that are using millimoles. So Often the scales with age. So the kids that are really young have a really high sensitivity. So like a 2-year-old might have a 300 or so, maybe a little bit more sensitivity. 4, 5, 6, 7-year-olds could easily have a 200 sensitivity during the day, or more, depending on all that kind of stuff. More sensitive means bigger number. So how Loop uses ISF. So how far, it's basically a measure of how far that active insulin or insulin on board will move you once food's gone. So when you're looking at the end of a prediction line, after the absorption window you entered is kind of gone, you'll kind of see, first, those of you that are more sensitive, you'll see a pretty significant drop, like your kids will kind of drop pretty far at the end of the prediction line. And that's where you can more obviously see the ISF coming into the picture. Like it expects you to have a certain amount of insulin when you get to another 2 hours out, maybe 3 hours after your fast food that you just ate. Fast meaning quick, not fast food that lasts a long time. So you'll be able to see kind of how that drop happens, and that's where you kind of see the ISF. Also, when you're sleeping, there shouldn't be much food going on, so that's kind of how far you're going to move in your sleep with a certain amount of insulin. And again, that assumes that basal is accurate. So if your basal is too high, you may be making your ISF too high also, just to compensate, when really you should be changing your basal. So these things play together, and basal is king. In case you guys get confused about any of this, if you're going to get anything right, you got to get basal right before anything else can be figured out. I don't think I put that in here enough, but it also comes into play in something we sort of touched on last time about carb absorption screen, that ICE screen. I'll mention it here, and then we'll probably spend more time talking about it later. But
Kenny, we have a question.
Sure, yeah.
Is it common to have several ISF numbers throughout the day? How would you suggest to test to ensure the ISF of each hour?
So again, testing is key. So the way, I'll give a link, but Katie has a really good, actually 2 different blog posts on her cmycgm.com site for the Juicebox folks, as well as just one called Fine Tuning Settings, and it talks about testing ISF. Basically, to test ISF, you have to get most of the food gone, or pretty much all the food gone, get your blood sugar up high enough that you can safely give yourself some kind of insulin to bring you back down. So she recommends using like a glucose tab or juice or something, some food that would wear off really quickly. And then, not running around, no food, just like basal testing, you would give yourself some amount of insulin. It could be a quarter unit, could be a half unit, could be a unit. If it's a kid, you probably want to give a lot less. And then you just kind of need to let it run its course for a few hours. And then kind of see where you end up. And then you have to make sure you turn that back into a 1 unit scale, right? So if you're going to test a half unit, kind of double the number of points you end up moving over that kind of 3, 4. I mean, truly, why we talked about insulin duration, you really need to wait like 5 or 6 hours. But insulin gets so weak at the end that you're going to get a close enough number at around 4 hours. So that's not a fun test, because it basically means you got to have no food or anything else for a while, get your blood sugar up, wait a little longer, and then give insulin and wait a lot longer. In terms of the number of ISF settings, I'll show you what I do with Tessa at the end. And I'll show you what I think works or has worked for a lot of people I've helped, but you still kind of got to test if you really want to know your number. I do know of a couple, at least one endo that was talking about helping his patients with Loop at a presentation I was at, and hooks them up to like IV insulin and gets the kind of measure a lot faster, kind of a good blood sugar measurement and insulin faster. So basically he can, in his like appointment with his patient, can test ISF with a fair amount of accuracy just sitting in the office for like 45 minutes. So but that's not the kind of equipment we often have at home. So
okay, so Kenny, if you're doing this without food, how long do you have to be without food before you start your test?
Yeah, you need to make sure the food's done. So most food is going to be done within 3 hours for sure. If it's faster food, like graham cracker, whatever, piece of fruit. that kind of thing. I mean, you probably shouldn't do an ISF test when you've eaten pizza, right? I mean, you wouldn't want a basal test then either. Not a good idea. That can hang out for a while. So, 3 hours is probably sufficient. So you're talking about this probably taking a 7-hour period of testing, but I'm not going to cover it in enough detail in this presentation, but you can start to see once you get your basal right, and carb ratio is a little easier, just kind of like eyeball in the graphs. Once you get those two figured out, then ISF becomes a little more apparent. So there'll be some situations that naturally occur that maybe you don't eat between lunch and dinner. And, again, I've tried this with Tessa and it works fairly well. If you were to food's gone from lunch and you still have a little while before dinner, if you treat with a little bit of carbs because you're starting to go down, or not, it could just not be going low. But don't put it in Loop. Loop will mostly be using the momentum, the speed of your blood sugar increase, as well as the ISF to calculate how far to bring you down back to range. It's really the only math that should be, or the primary math that should be involved at that point. And so if you're using something like automatic bolus, it does make it easier to kind of test that in a short period of time because it can deliver that insulin faster. Or you could even keep watching your phone and just give the recommended boluses. And if you end up going low before dinner, that can kind of be your indication that ISF is a little bit too strong. Like Loop shouldn't have made you go down quite that low. That's
Okay,
kind of like a
couple of questions. Do you visualize for the most part one ISF?
I don't, but that is a good place to start. As I'll mention later, starting with one of everything, one carb ratio, one ISF, one basal, makes it easier to kind of see where the differences, like maybe changes need to do. Some people like to do a reset where we just kind of pick one across the board and then kind of adjust back from there.
And do you see higher ISF when there is a higher BG?
Good question. Like, does it scale? If the question is, does sensitivity scale with blood sugar? I don't know the answer to that. And some people suspect the answer is you get less sensitive the higher you go because your blood's not moving as fast through your body. But I'm not necessarily sure that sensitivity is just that you can't get the insulin through you as quickly. But if the question is, when you see high blood sugar a lot, is that because of ISF? And I would say not necessarily. It totally depends.
Okay, yeah, the follow-up on that question was like a stubborn high from a failed site. So that's a one of.
Yeah, that's more of an active insulin issue where Loop is seeing all that IOB we mentioned. It thinks all that insulin went in, but it was really leaking or not quite absorbing right. So Loop thinks you got all of it, and a third of it was leaking out of your cannula or whatever and not going into your body. So that's more of a mismatch of what Loop expects is in your body versus what actually made it into your body. So fixing that's a little bit different.
And one more question, should you test an open loop?
If you're going to test ISF, strictly speaking from like Kitty's settings or anybody else like integrated diabetes, anybody who's posting how to do that, then yes, you'd want to do all of this kind of stuff in open loop to minimize the influence. Another interesting thing about open loop though is, largely speaking, ISF kind of, by going into open loop, you sort of take ISF out of the picture in terms of the math, because you're probably only going to be looking at recommendations when you're eating, because you're not going to be having your phone up every 5 minutes. So if you're just mostly bolusing and checking for more boluses in case, Loop recommends more or basal increases, whatever, that sort of takes ISF out of the picture. Like if you're worried that your ISF is so far off and you're not sure if it's affecting how your carbs are being processed, then open looping with your carb ratio and just making sure you're checking frequently enough for, any recommendations if you started to go low before the meal and Loop didn't give you enough insulin, like those kind of situations. But if you just go into open loop, you kind of remove ISF out of it to kind of test your carb ratio. So,
okay. I'm sorry.
ISF is,
one more question.
ISF is hard to test. Okay.
Is ISF only for food?
Yeah. Is it only for food?
Yeah.
Is that your question?
That's the question.
Okay. I see it. Okay. So, no, it's, so you can see on the right here, the second point. So the first one is how far insulin on board will push you down without food. The first one there is strictly on the right is the his ISF is actually how you test ISF. That's how you get the number. I'm just letting you know with the second point that based on your sensitivity, Loop assumes a certain amount of movement in your blood sugar when you consume a single carbohydrate. So, or any amount of carbohydrate. So if you are, and the reason is you kind of see this with kids is, and a bunch of stuff online about this too, where someone who may have like a 200 ISF, like Tessa, she's kind of in that 200 range. Let's say your ISF is 200, Loop sort of assumes that 1 gram of carb will move you 20 points. So 200 ISF would be 20 mgdl, give or take. If you're 300, then 1 gram of carb might move you 30 points, somewhere around there. If you're someone who's more like 50 ISF, then it only expect the movement of 5 points for 1 gram of carbohydrate. So that's just kind of 200 range. So you should kind of see that, like again because ISF scales with age, and we tend to see that information presented to us by age, how much a carb will move you, or body weight, and sensitivity scales with body weight as well. That's why it's involved in the carbohydrate count. So it affects what Loop sees in that absorption screen, how many carbs it saw absorb. The ISF has a big play in that, but it doesn't impact a ton of how much Loop will recommend how much insulin to give you. But at the beginning of a meal, at the end of a meal, how it's shaping up, how many carbs it saw, it can affect that. So if your ISF's too high, you might see more carbs sooner. And so it's like, oh, your meal's done, so I'm going to stop expecting carbohydrates impact on your blood sugar, yet you keep climbing. So that can kind of throw things off too. So if your ISF is way off, it can affect how Loop processes kind of the last half of a meal. But at the beginning, the initial recommendation for a bolus, no. You will see the prediction line go higher if you're more sensitive. If you have a higher number ISF. So if you were to enter carbs and then not give a bolus, you'd see where your eventual number will be higher if your sensitivity is higher than it would be if it was lower.
Okay, a few more questions. Sorry, Kenny. I have not closed Loop yet. So when you say recommendations, does Loop bring up a prompt to take an action in closed Loop? It's harder to monitor Loop when it's on my daughter's.
No. So in closed Loop, that's the point of closed Loop, is there's no prompting. It's just doing stuff. Loop's taking action. So it won't prompt. If you were to hit the bolus button in closed Loop though, and there is a recommendation, then you would see it there, but it's not going to ask you. There has been a number of requests out there to have a notification or something pop up on the iPhone if a bolus is recommended, but that hasn't been acted on over the years. So okay. No.
And then I think this is probably accurate. The last bullet point, isn't that you actually carb ratio?
Isn't the last bullet point actually carb ratio? No. So carb ratio is how much insulin does it take to cover the carbs. It's talking about how much insulin is needed to cover the carbs you're going to eat. Does not have to do with how much your blood sugar should move if you were to not have insulin. So that's kind of why it's different.
Great.
Okay. There we go. So ISF's a little hard for people to wrap their head around, and while it's often the one Katie mentions to test second, and it's important to do, it is probably harder to see it once you're in closed loop, unless you get really used to it. So we'll talk about it a little more. So a couple of ISF examples, the roller coaster thing people like to refer to. Too strong of a roller coaster, too strong of ISF when there's no food on board, nothing like that. So sleeping, this is what this picture is on the left. You'll often see it kind of paired with high increases of temp basal rates or boluses if you're using auto bolus, and then back off again, on and off, on and off. But I added some markings on this to kind of indicate if you had really good basal and you were seeing ISF that was too strong, you would want to see positive IOB as your blood sugar is falling, kind of reaching right at the bottom of the trough of that wave should be 0. IOB should be right around 0. And as they start going up, you should see negative IOB. So it's hard to see how much ISF is strong, or if ISF is too strong, if your basal's not right. So again, basal first, but that's kind of what you would see. I guess it's kind of an extra way to test your basal a bunch. If you grade your ISF too strong, but kept your range up high enough that you wouldn't go low while this was happening, you could give yourself a bunch of times to sort of test your basal if you made a bunch of troughs, a bunch of waves in your graph. The second one here is a little harder because it can kind of depend if it's basal or ISF, but you do see this where if the ISF is too weak, then Loop can't get you down to your range. Just as if your basal's not strong enough, it has a really hard time getting you down to your range as well. But you kind of see the prediction line, the purple one, and Nightscout on the right, and the little orange box I highlighted says eventually 78, and she's at 130 around this point. It never really happens, even with the basal being off. Like you can tell it's still got quite a ways to go. It's 50 points or so, 40, 50 points is a lot to move, and wasn't really anywhere close to that. So this can indicate that this is actually from Tessa just the other night. She was just she needed more insulin overall, probably a little bit of basal too, but we had pizza. So, it's probably more resistance than it is basal because we had pizza, just kind of fat hanging around longer, or pasta. I can't remember what we had, one of those. But you're not able to get down to your target. So again, you have to get the basal right to know if it's ISF, because that picture on the right there, the second picture, could be either one. So let's get basal right first. Okay, everybody got that? Basal right first. Okay. Okay, so now we're getting into more my opinions and how you test things. So you don't have to read all this, but basically don't blame me if something goes wrong. But again, I'm going to say what Katie reminded me to say, which is you got to test to know if it's right. But I'll tell you what I've seen and what's working for me and quite a few others that I've been helping out. And even if some of this isn't technically accurate in terms of what should be represented in Loop, I find it's a little safer using certain things. So I'll let you see that. Here we go. Okay, so what I've found with some studies that I'll link at the end of the slide deck here is at night, you kind of have this whole other thing going on you don't deal with during the day. A lot of it's human growth hormone, either HGH or GH. You'll see it represented here. And growth hormone creates resistance to insulin. One NIH study, it doesn't make blood sugar go up, I guess, but it's more just it creates resistance to blood sugar. So when people say hormones, that's kind of usually part of the ones they're talking about, the most common one. These are released during your rapid eye movement sleep cycles. You can kind of see in the bottom picture here, the volume of growth hormone kind of goes up and down here as you sleep cycle. And this sort of mimics your sleep cycle. You kind of have a couple of cycles and then they start to really slow down in terms of how frequent cycles happen overnight. And so the growth hormone quantity tends to drop. The other example here you see is the cortisol can go up. And it does go up for people, but that's sort of age-based too. I'm not going to dive into cortisol. Katie did a fantastic job with a blog post on seemycgm.com about that. Food processes a little bit differently while you're sleeping. Didn't link anything here, but just a combination of things that can make digestion kind of slow, but also can sort of speed up. Like it can dump stuff into the rest of your system, kind of move things through your system at a different rate that would be a little bit different than daytime. I find that basal tends to stay the same. And I say that because when we were on shots and we could only use long-acting insulin and then boluses, I was tracking that insulin on board, the active insulin we talked about, using a similar duration of insulin action that Loop uses. So I was kind of doing what Loop was doing before I knew about it. And I would bolus through these crazy rises that would occasionally occur when my daughter would go to sleep. But and the basal stayed the same because that's all we had was Lantus. So, but by the time the blood sugar sort of landed, it was always right around insulin on board equaled about 0 when you're talking the duration of how long the insulin lasted. So my gut is that her basal rate didn't actually change. And I'll show you a couple examples of why. Even if it does change, I think it's a little more dangerous to schedule a basal change at night if you can avoid it, because when you go to sleep will change. So it's hard to prepare for that properly without potentially causing a low if you stay up later or your kid decides they just don't want to go to sleep or whatever the the thing is. Like I've done increased like overrides and other basal rate increases overnight and actually landed kind of at an IOB equals 0 and level before. So it's not that you can't use basal for these kind of rises that happen at night, that everyone experiences to some degree, especially if you eat near your sleep time. Just the velocity by which they happen kind of depends on age. You can see this top graph here. How much human growth hormone you produce in a given day kind of scales with your age. When you're like under 10, you have a lot, and it starts to reduce over time. But everyone has it. It's used for like repairing your body and things of that nature. So my assumption was basal stayed the same. At least I feel like that was the safest thing to do, was just to keep bolusing or giving injections and then landing it, because it would always expire at the right time. So I'm like, we'll just stick with that. Feel like it made it more predictable when that situation at night can be unpredictable. So things you can try to kind of see how this affects you or your child is to try eating lighter food or faster consuming processing food for dinner. Also trying to put more time between eating and sleep. I found like 3-4 hours is great, especially if the meal's lighter. If it's a heavier meal, you're gonna have to wait. You know, it's one of those pizza icon meals. You're gonna have to wait a long time, or you're just gonna see it hit. And then, or exercising or walking kind of before you go to bed. So kind of some of these things people say is good for you, like don't eat before bed and go for a walk. Oh, well, I know what I forgot. Sorry, I forgot to include a screenshot of me, but I'll just give a quick story. So I wore a sensor for a couple of weeks as well with one of the reset transmitters. Thank you, Katie. And so I saw that this happened to me too. So my blood sugar would go up. Actually, probably the highest it ever was when I was wearing it would be if I ate something like ice cream and then went to sleep. And it would stay up for a long time. If I didn't eat right near bed, near going to sleep, then it went up a little, but it wasn't nearly as significant. Even if I stayed up, like I ate something like ice cream that's got some fat in it, and I waited for my blood sugar to start coming down, then I went to sleep, but you see a pretty significant rise. So, you know, all for the sake of science, you have to eat yummy stuff before bed. Yeah, so I saw the same thing with me with the functioning pancreas versus my daughter. It's kind of a similar pattern. It's just harder to manage. So again, this is my experience and a little bit of research and stuff provided by others in the Loop group that sent me down this path. But that's how I think sleep and why sleep can be a little challenging to manage. It's not that it's absent of carbs and activity, but it still has some other dynamics happening at night. Okay, so here's again stuff I've learned. Here we go. Simple makes it easier to test or spot differences. So if you feel like you're way off or you kind of want to start over, just take a backup or a screenshot or notes of your settings, and then just pick one of everything, and then start over. Again, basal's king. You got to get basal right first. ISF and carb ratios will help too. So again, using the Nightscout reports to help you find where you see those negative IOB and still falling blood sugar, those will help you spot when basal needs to be adjusted. I can't remember what slide I put this on. Oh, here, next one, okay. So try, I think keeping your basal rates down to as few as you can is reasonable based on the data you have in Nightscout reports as well as doing actual basal testing. Makes it easy. I found one works really well for most people, but there are plenty of situations where you need more than one. I sort of see like one overnight. You might have another one during the day, or you might just have one right before you wake up, which I'll cover in a second. There's some other situations we'll talk about, but it should become more obvious using the information that Loop is providing in closed loop with the insulin on board. It should be really helpful. ISF, in my experience, tends to be lower or a stronger ISF at night than during the day because of the growth hormone concept. I think that's the why. I noticed it already, but I think that's sort of like the why I've come to. But, you know, be careful with it. Don't get too crazy with stuff. ISF changes overnight from growth hormones and processing food during sleep. And then ISF also seems to change during activity, which we mentioned in the last, I think was the last one, where like exercise, your body's moving faster and blood's moving faster. So your sensitivity seems to go up temporarily. while you're exercising. You might have a basal shift as well, might have a decreased basal need because your body's sort of consuming some, it doesn't need as much insulin. So that may be true, but you definitely have an ISF change when you're like running. If you're weightlifting, it's a different kind of sensitivity change with lactic acid and things trying to make your blood sugar go up. So again, arguable if it's a basal change or sensitivity, but definitely for like aerobic exercises, cardio, you're going to see a sensitivity change. Carb ratios are pretty close to the same all day. And there are some people that need, a significantly lower one in the morning. But again, pick one that seems to work well for lunch and dinner and maybe even breakfast, and then kind of see if you can mess with ISF and some other things, or getting your basal right again is key. But having radically different ratios, I find, is sometimes confuses people and can hide certain things. So it's not that you don't need it. I would just make sure you do some extra testing and be extra confident that that's what's working. So simple is best. Okay, some more stuff on basal. So basal is too strong is easier to spot than too weak, because I showed you in those graphs the negative. Too strong means you're going to have a negative IOB and your blood sugar is going to continue to fall. So if it's not quite strong enough, you're going to see kind of like positive insulin on board, but you're not quite getting down the way you think maybe that little bit of insulin should get you down. You're going to have a tougher time getting to your target range. But it can be other things that cause that too, so it can be a little challenging to figure out. So if you think you're really close on your basal, maybe even bump it up a click and then just keep an eye on those situations, especially overnight, but really any time during the day that you see that. Any negative IUB at any part of the day. So this is often like overnight, but then also like right before meals is usually just long enough, especially with the automatic bolus branch, to kind of show if you end up having this situation where you get that dip, that negative underneath the graph in Nightscout, and still continue to fall, and you kind of catch it with a meal. So anytime during the day, that means your basal probably needs to go down. If it's a temporary thing and you feel like you're just more sensitive all day today, then fine, write it off and try the next day. But if you see a pattern of this, a basal needs to change, but it could be a basal anytime in the last 5 to 6 hours. The general convention is, you got to change your basal 1 to 2 hours before you need it, kind of thing. But realistically, like we talked about with Loop's insulin action time, insulin lasts 5 to 6 hours. So a buildup of insulin from a really high basal, especially if it's more dramatic, a really high basal earlier in the day, can have an impact as far as 5 and 6 hours out. So it's a little harder to spot. That's why, again, testing is important, open loop and all that kind of stuff. But if you're looking at the reports in Nightscout, if you have a radically different basal shift, then you might want to blame the bigger one if it's causing kind of a negative IOP situation. So don't just look in the last 2 hours. And if it's a big enough increase, I've seen people have a radical increase in basal, maybe like during the day from night. So they'll wake up and then it increases by a lot. And so that can actually cause you to start going down pretty quickly if that rate changes fast enough. So again, don't think, oh, well, now I'm getting negative IOP or I'm going down, but it hasn't been long enough yet. It hasn't been 1 to 2 hours. Like, if it's a big enough change, it'll make a difference. Exceptions to this that I've seen so far, I'm sure there's more to come, but sharp drops before waking. There's a couple of people that have a pretty significant drop at kind of 5 in the morning or something like that, sometimes 3 or 4 in the morning. I temper that to say, like, oftentimes at 3 to 5 or 6 in the morning is actually when you'd see an accumulation of when your basal's too high, you'd see that. So it gets a little hard to notice, but it's either because you have all your basal's too high and it's been high kind of all night, even though your blood sugar might be high, but your basal rate is too high. You'll get that negative IOB and falling. But sometimes if you get nice steady IOB is near 0 before that time and you're nailing it, and all of a sudden, no matter what you do, it just keeps dropping, every couple nights or even every night. You try increasing ISF to make it more sensitive just in case you're carrying any insulin on board. All that during those times, but you still fall, then that's definitely a time you should look at, modifying a basal rate, cutting it in half for an hour or something small like that, to see if it helps. So there's definitely some people that have some pretty significant drops that just like they don't need almost any insulin for an hour or so, and that's kind of crazy. It's not super common, but it's not uncommon either, so I'd mention that. Stress.
We've
So,
got a question, got an interesting question
okay.
from Jessica. ISF is it 2 hours pre blood sugar change like basal, or is it
So, good
specific
question.
to time?
Um, so the way Loop uses it is its time, because it doesn't. My understanding is it's not really looking out too far in the prediction to see how the ISF is going to change and then take action based on the future. Loop's really mostly concerned about ISF when it's in its calculations for right now. So, like if you're going to go exercise, for example, and you want to try raising your ISF for a little while to try that, then you'd want to do it from right now and past kind of when you think you're going to be done exercising. Even if you're only going to exercise in another hour, you'd want to change it ahead of time, like right now. But that's because you want Loop to start turning off the basal and start eating up all that extra active insulin, knowing that if you have a lot of active insulin before you go run or something, it's going to cause you to drop. So that'll kind of tell Loop to start cutting basal, because you say, oh, I'm going to be really sensitive here for the next couple hours. But it's more of a now thing than a build up like basal. So good question. Bottom one there. So school or work stress. You may have increased basal needs, or sometimes all around needs as a result. I know a lot of kids go high when they get to school. I know a couple of friends of mine, or even a coworker, that blood sugar tends to be a little bit more difficult to manage, wants to kind of go up and takes more insulin to come down because of stress. And if the day is more stressful, that can change as well. Because we don't have profiles, my recommendation often for people is to try to see if an override will work for those situations, because I bet on the weekends, for example, you probably don't have that increased need. So I try to stress to people, let's find like your what I call baseline settings. So excuse me, normal reduced stress kind of times, weekends and nights, things like that. They're usually a good place.
Okay, I want to throw you one more question. Can you just set a higher target for the specific time? That's what I think she means to ask.
Can you set a target? Oh, well, like a correction range. If you're talking about correction range, you can set a correction range for a specific time. You can also use an override that only changes the target, the correction range. So, and that will run for like right now, not just in the future. So you're changing where the prediction will be, like what Loop will do, but you're changing the correction range for right now. Yeah. So the thing with overrides, I didn't create a slide for overrides, but once you can test basal by looking at that negative IOB line and kind of how things are performing inside of Nightscout, either the live page or the reports, you can use that same trick of testing your basal or verifying your basal in closed loop when you're using an override to see if it's too much. Because remember, overrides are changing your basal rate as well as everything else. So when my daughter's sick, for example, which I didn't grab a screenshot of, sorry, I took a guess. I did 130% override because she was riding higher all night and thinking maybe she just needed more insulin today. So I turned it on and we had breakfast, and she ended up kind of tanking after breakfast a little bit. So I thought, okay, this is too strong, but I didn't know how strong or wasn't sure if maybe it was just something we messed up with the food. So later on, just a couple hours after breakfast, I could check Nightscout and see that, or the Loop app, and saw that she had negative IOB, but she was still active insulin and she was still continuing to fall. And so we had to keep treating it and things like that. So that'll tell you that your override's too strong, because that's again a basal change. But that's also why when you're gonna like kind of verify or try, if you want to test your basal in closed loop using some of these reports, you need to make sure you avoid using overrides that change your basal. I totally forgot to put it in here as a slide. So don't use overrides that are not 100% while you're trying to double check your basal in a closed loop situation, or even in an open loop, but in a closed loop situation. You definitely want to make sure you are only using target change only while you're checking that. So hopefully that helps. And if you go and put a 200% override on, I can't figure out why you have negative IOB and falling later in the day. Well, that's why. Okay, ISF, what I've learned. So after basal is spot on, is the only time you can really trust your ISF settings. Like you can tweak them while you're trying to figure out basal, but it has to be right. Otherwise, your ISF settings are not helpful. So you can set the correction range a little bit higher at night, and then make ISF a little bit too strong where you start getting those waves that I showed you a picture of. That way it's not causing any lows and you're not having to treat them. So you give it time and space in the sort of blood sugar range to kind of witness it should kind of come up on its own and go back down on its own because of Loop's actions. And seeing that IOB is 0 near the bottom, positive before, negative after in that wave. If you give it room to do that, you can say, okay, my basal is probably pretty good and my ISF is obviously too strong. So you start making it weaker, so you stop getting rid of those. During different parts of the night, is the easiest way to do this. And then I find on average, again, you should really test this too, just to be sure, that 10 to 20% higher than whatever you like right before you wake up. Unless you have like a really big resistance in the morning, which some people do, that makes it harder. But I would say just increase it 10 or 20% as a good place to jump off of to see this is probably pretty close to my daytime ISF. It's a little bit bigger of a number than my overnight right before I wake up. I use that just to kind of give people a ballpark. Again, it's no substitute for testing, but it can get you a little closer. Some exceptions, cortisol rises, you may need a lower ISF for a couple hours as you wake up rather than making it a bigger number during the day. And exercise may require a higher ISF. Again, testing is important. There's some people that have been doing this looping thing longer than me that think we only need like one or only a couple ISFs. So, differing opinions on it, but I'm letting you know how I got there. So again, don't take this as gold. This is just what's working for me, and a few others have been helping. Here's an example of why I am a little hesitant to, especially for my daughter who has varying sleep times, increasing basal during rises at night, and why ISF seems to be an okay substitute. Is at night 1, we had Chinese food. She went to bed at normal time, kind of 8:30ish. I didn't totally mismanage the Chinese food, maybe a little light, but I gave quite a bit of insulin before she went to sleep, knowing she'd probably go up. And it took a lot of insulin to bring her back down, but eventually it cut back out. And you can kind of see up here through the circle here, sorry about that she leveled out, and she had some negative IOB, but she was climbing during that time as Loop added more. And then it sort of like caught and was pretty level all night. And again, I'm using a single basal rate through that whole period of time. So we're used to kind of these sort of level periods at night. And so this is just ISF changes and manual boluses, by the way, without changing the basal. Now, night 2, the next night, she went over to Grandpa's house while my wife and I went out, and she had a burger and some other related food that's long. And she played around outside right afterwards, kind of this up and down here you see. And then Grandpa didn't get her home until around this 8 o'clock time. We treated this low just minimally that was coming. And then we put her to sleep. And she wasn't asleep until probably right around 10:30, right about here. She kind of went up a little on her own, and I wasn't home, so I wasn't there to manually bolus, but Luke did some small boluses and kind of caught it, and everything's fine. And then I'll go on to the next one here. This is the same burger situation. She had the burger, went to sleep at like 10:30. And then the whole rest of the night was pretty level, right? So if I had a stronger basal rate running at her normal sleep time or just before her normal sleep time, she would have inevitably gone much lower than this. Now, as you'll see in Tessa's example settings that I'm using, her ISF is significantly lower or stronger during this kind of 8 to 9 o'clock and 10 o'clock time frame. And you would think by looking at the number that it would cause a radical like low. They would just get her way down, which is why we treated early kind of up here, because I knew that Luke probably overdid it when she went high and she was running around. So it's a combination of things. So her ISF was actually higher because she was running around, but it was extra low based on the settings. But you see, it didn't cause like repeat lows. It didn't, anything really strong kind of stopped. So I find this to be a little bit safer. And I think if you want to play with this idea of using kind of lower ISF at the beginning of sleep, just know that this could still happen, right? It's a similar problem to having too strong of a basal while you're awake, when you normally schedule it to kind of manage those rises. But for me, it's when those rises don't show up, even the food you'd think would cause it. That basal ends up being too much, and you end up with negative IOV, and then you have a problem all night long with loop, especially. So I find ISF changes a little bit safer, even if you could argue that basal is probably what should be changed. So just an example for staying up 2 hours later than normal and being active. So, and putting time and exercise between her food and dinner. So kind of had best of all that, basically. So here's a quiz for you. You can feel free to write in the chat if you want, or just answer in your own head. But looking at this picture here, what caused this low primarily? Is it ISF or is it basal? I'll give you guys a second to look at this. Because this kind of looks like a roller coaster, right? So is it an ISF roller coaster? Or is the basal not right? Anybody know? Anybody want to put it? I'll give you a number in a little bit. Pops. Anybody want to put in the chat? Anybody want to throw out basal?
We're seeing a lot of basal.
Anybody ISF? Anybody thinking this is an ISF roller coaster? Because we see this a lot in Looped, right? And people say this is a roller coaster. One person says ISF a microbolus. Okay. Good. Okay. So real quick on the microbolus or mini boluses there. Microbolusing or autobolusing, the small boluses, should not be the reason that you end up having problems, right? I find that the autobolus branch or microbolus flavor from someone else makes your settings, if they're wrong, much more apparent, because it's giving more insulin sooner because it can. And so if your settings are wrong, you're going to have probably like a low, for example, a lot sooner. And so it just makes it more obvious and actually puts that low a little closer to when something might actually be wrong, instead of like the increasing temp basal and then it backs off maybe sooner because it has time to do that. It's a lot slower than the boluses. Okay, so the answer is basal. So I'm highlighting the spots here. You can see the basal is too strong. The yellow boxes highlight where you're seeing a drop, as well as negative IOB being present. The red arrows are where I talked to this person and they confirmed that they in fact treated and they didn't log any carbs, right? So that's the hard part, is if they're not logged, it's hard to see. So if they treated in these spots and you saw a continuing negative insulin on board and a falling situation, this is what happens when your basal is, this is in this case significantly too high, but it can, you guys have probably all seen this the night before with your kids or with you, where you treat and then they go up and Loop kind of pushes them back down again. So this is why I highlighted with ISF. It's most obvious when ISF is too strong if you're not having to treat. But if your target range is so low, like kind of 85 or 80 or something like that, and you treat at 70, let's say, if ISF is too strong, it's kind of hard to know if it's ISF or not because you're treating with carbs if you end up going low. But more often than not, if you look at the negative insulin on board, if that's what's happening, then you know it's basal. If it's positive insulin on board, then yeah, it's very likely carb ratio, or if you're logging the carbs, or ISF if you're not. Because you have to see the negative insulin on board. And I think that's one thing that kind of frustrates me a little bit looking in Looped occasionally. The group, people will say it's ISF when they see something like this, but you can't really know unless you know what the active insulin is during this period. You can't tell otherwise. So good. So this is not a roller coaster from ISF, okay? Not. Okay. So this is just another example of basal being a little bit too strong. You see some in the red boxes here, falling blood sugar and negative insulin on board starting to accrue in here. And then kind of happens again. Now Loop's catching it because of the momentum. So this isn't a situation where you're constantly going low, but you do kind of, you see it here. I think I might have cut this off. This might be Tessa. And I was using an override because she was going high in the night, and it ended up being too much later on. I cut off the top, sorry. Might be somebody else though, I don't remember. And then same over here. This can even happen. You see it right here at like 11, in the morning, but also you can see it kind of right before dinner at like 5, and then again at 8 before they ate again. So no, this isn't Tessa. She wouldn't be eating 8 o'clock. That wouldn't happen in my house. She goes to sleep. I don't need to make my life more difficult, right? We talked about this. If you're eating right before you go to sleep, try to avoid that if we can. So again, this can happen at all times during the day. It doesn't just have to be at night, but you can kind of see it at night easier. And you can see this person has varying basal rates. You can see the dotted line up here, and then it drops down a little bit, and it's lower during the day, and then goes back up at night, probably to counter for, so people often raise basal rates when they don't really know why they're high consistently. And it's often because we have bigger, heavier meals for dinner. I think your sensitivity does tend to change even before you go to sleep as your kind of circadian rhythm, as you're getting ready for sleep. That's probably more often what happens. So people tend to raise basal when they see kind of somewhat of a pattern. They're higher at night. If you look at the kind of last 3 months at once or 2 weeks at once, and you kind of look at your trend, that's when people do it. I find it's better to check your basal day to day, knowing the situations, and checking like this negative IOB situation here. Now your sensitivities and your basal needs can change day to day. So let's not hold it too tightly, but you kind of want to see what most often works when you feel like things are in a fairly normal situation when you're kind of verifying this information. Then what I see happens is that you can then use overrides much more effectively once you kind of figure out what your general normal is. I'll even, if Tessa runs just a little bit higher than her target of 85 to 90 at night, if she's running like 105, but level all day, maybe even up a little bit here and there all night long, when I wake up in the morning, I might put a 110 override on and run that all day, and that'll help keep everything in line. But every time I choose to use an override for a period of time, I'm always checking for negative insulin on board, because at some point she's going to kind of flip back to her normal insulin needs. And sometimes it happens in the middle of the day. Most often it's like right before bed, or kind of this like 4 a.m. to 6 a.m. is when I see all of a sudden negative IOB starts accruing, and then we need to change back to our normal basal rates. So
okay, a question, Kenny.
Yeah.
Could any of that been from a too strong a correction?
The negative IOB, that is a great question. Thank you, Sarah. I did not put that in here. I tell people this all the time, and I forgot. No. So if you ever see negative insulin on board and falling blood sugar, it's because basal is too strong. If you see positive insulin on board and you're falling, yeah, you probably did a manual correction that was too much, or ISF is too strong, which means your phone did too much insulin. But if it's negative and you're falling, that should never happen. Like unless you're running or like running around right as the end of the insulin's happening. But when you run out of insulin, when you're at IOB of 0 and you're not active, you should be level or going up if you see negative, no matter what. So it can happen 15, 20, usually I've seen it like in an hour after they bolus for a meal. If you see you're falling and you have negative, it means your basal is like way too strong. If you just gave yourself a food bolus and you still ended up running out of insulin according to Loop, but still falling. So no, that's why another reason I feel like it's safer to use ISF instead of basal at night is I can bolus the bejesus out of the rise that's happening from her food, and I don't lose track of what I consider a little bit safer number for active insulin, right? So because remember, active insulin is how much insulin above and beyond the scheduled basal that you have. So if I increase the scheduled basal for her night rises, then it will consider less of that insulin it's giving as active. So I'd rather be on the safer side and say there's too much insulin on board than maybe there really is, than have not enough, because then you end up with a negative and then a constant kind of fighting at night when you're treating and coming up and being pushed back down. So this Loop currently doesn't eliminate negative IOB very easily. It doesn't, so insulin decays over 6 hours in the normal model. But negative IOB, if you start the night with it, let's say 2 a.m., and you could go until 8 or 9 or 10 a.m., and that negative could still be there. You could wake up with a slight negative. It never decays over time. It doesn't give it back to you. It's not like, hey, you've been level this whole time. It's probably not negative. You're not going up. It's not smart enough currently to say, hey, this probably isn't really negative. You're probably at IOB 0 because you're nice and flat. So But yeah, great question, Sarah. Great question. All right, here's another sample, that same person that we got the example from. This was before when basal was way too strong, and then you can see after they've cut basal, but you can still tell it's still a little bit too strong. So this was actually just a couple days after the first one there. And what you see on the right is a little more their average now versus their average on the left was a little more like that, coming down from a high after, eating or something, a rise from food. And so you can kind of see how reducing basal sometimes starts to smooth it out. More often than not, I see people with basal that's too high, not that it's too weak. I mean, I see both, but so it creates a much smoother set of lines. And then what you end up having to do, if you do end up, just remember this, if you're increasing basal, you probably, and you feel like food and meals are kind of going okay, then you're probably going to need to, if you're increasing basal, you need to decrease your carb ratios most likely. Maybe even ISF if you thought that was working well. Again, harder to tell. But even just a small change in basal creates a larger change in carb ratio. Then doesn't feel proportional, just so you know. And the same is true the other way. If you back off basal, like this example on the right, carb ratios will probably have to get a fair amount stronger to compensate for all that extra insulin that's not hanging out in your body as basal. So just know that those kind of go back and forth, and little tiny basal changes can make really big carb ratio changes and even ISF changes. So just keep that in mind as you're trying to figure out what your settings are, that they all play together, which is why you got to get your foundation built. You have to get basal figured out and you got to test it.
I think I can give a little bit of my experience in Cassidy. And,
yeah, let's do that.
We've all kind of followed your suggestions, and I was kind of stunned when we went to one basal. I had, I think, 6 or 7 profiles, and you said, "Oh, let's take it to 1," and my heart seized up. I've taken it down lower and lower, and my carb ratios, I take more insulin for carbs, but I am flatter. It works. It honestly works. It was just a hard adjustment to see how much insulin I was taking for meals, but I stay flat.
So you had to dramatically increase or strengthen your carb ratios when you backed off from the basal.
But,
And I found that almost the identical thing. The other thing I found was that my carb ratio was much more accurate, like in larger meals too. So the carb ratio, like my settings worked as long as I ate the same thing every day. But as soon as I went and had like a hamburger and fries or something, it didn't work. Well, now that I have a stronger carb ratio, that it actually works even on bigger meals too.
Cassidy or Aurelia?
Yeah, for me, my experience was not the same. My experience was actually fairly the opposite, because I had always only had one basal. So I was super used to that. And I was only really like working singular numbers, 1 basal, 1 carb rate, 1 ISF. So for me, working with Kenny, my biggest thing has been changing ISF. That's like, especially around exercise and around PMS, those things are like changing my entire like management strategy. So it's been really nice to just like focus in for me on ISF and like see how impactful that's been.
So so more what I've learned, in the end, there's no replacement for testing, for doing open loop testing and testing everything, as Katie mentions on the fine-tune settings, or the juice box, converting from juice box to loop is a more recent one, but it covers the same testing strategies in there. So open looping is great. When you get your basal and you feel like your basal, especially overnight, is locked in, maybe something scary for some of you, but especially for those that are caregivers, this is easier. If you go to sleep later than your T1 and they start to get down to kind of close to 0 IOB and they're kind of where you want them to be, then flip to open loop and just verify that it's pretty straight all night. Sometimes you'll find it straighter than in closed loop because there's less, like especially with compression lows, those will smooth out because it won't take action to cut back when it doesn't really need to. So try open looping overnight. That's a big big thing to try. It takes some guts. Some people get comfortable and feel safe with the closed loop, which is good. But open looping or waking yourself up if you had to, at 2 in the morning or 3 in the morning, and then rolling over, open looping and going back to sleep as best you can is also another good way to do it. That way, usually you're level and kind of in range around that time if your settings are pretty accurate, and you can try it. So open looping is definitely what you want to do. So here's some of the resources. So Katie's post is still killer. It's the one I found when I was in the ER and sort of taught me about when my daughter was diagnosed, and I learned all about all these different settings and what they do. So you really can't find a better resource most of the time for that blog post right there. Dr. Ponder talks about it in his sugar surfing, not that you need to be, not the dynamic sort of sugar surfing thing, but he just talks about how he found over time with himself too, and why that fewer basal rates made things a little easier and a little more accurate to manage. And again, it sort of touches on why I feel like it's a little safer sometimes to mess with ISF at night instead of basal, just because of the variability of how those nights can go. A little link to one of the studies on growth hormone secretion during sleep, in case you're curious. Then you have to find, I didn't link the one that talks about its impact on blood sugar, but that's kind of how it's released. So again, not as a template. If you're starting out in Loop, I'd say just do your own testing, but just as an idea of what I'm using when I talk about it. Basically the same carb ratio and kind of blocks of ISF changes, like every 3 hours or so through the night. And then daytime is 7 a.m. to 8 p.m. She runs at 210, is what we've gotten up to now. But then these other numbers are quite low. So the lower, like 8 p.m., so dinner carbs absorbed using that ice screen is off and not always perfect because I'm changing the ISF, and I mentioned how that affects how many carbs Loop sees. So by doing this, sometimes you're going to mess up using that other tool to be able to measure carbs. So for me to test carb ratio for dinner, I would need to switch the ISF back to her daytime and really try to keep her awake longer, so her food could be done processing before she goes to sleep. Otherwise, sleep's going to mess up the whole thing anyway. So, and one basal rate and some targets. So, just so you guys know, for those of you that watched the last one about trying to figure out carb absorption on that ice screen, you tap on that green graph in Loop. You're going to have to play with it. And my encouragement to you is to kind of really get it into your own head, is you probably should look at some completed meals and then change your carb ratio like noticeably, and your ISF during that same time frame noticeably, and see how the numbers of carbs it absorbs changes. Because I can put it up on a slide and I can explain it and you can listen to it a bunch of times, but until you touch it and play with it and see how the numbers change, it probably won't stick in your head real well. And so that's why, and by knowing that if you move your carb ratio and your ISF like the same percentage change, you end up with basically the same number of carbs absorbed, is a really good example of what Kate and Katie both say of having two wrongs make a right. You can lower everything way down or raise everything way up, and you'll end up with the same carbs seen in Loop because of the way that screen functions and how it uses ISF and carb ratio together. So you just need to know that, like, but Loop's telling me it sees the same carbs that I entered. That doesn't mean your carb ratio and ISF are wrong. It might mean that they're both wrong if you're not seeing results you'd expect. So that's a quick reminder. We'll cover that again with my slides on Wednesday. That's fine.
Kenny, I think you did an amazing job. I couldn't think of a better way to spend a Sunday afternoon. Thank you, everybody. If you have any more questions, definitely feel free to post them on SoCal Loopers. Try to go out and get a little fresh air today or tomorrow, but don't have any accidents. Try to stay healthy and safe, and we'll see you on Wednesday.